The Nelson Mandela Foundation has launched a new podcast series. It's called the Freedom After Podcast, exploring South Africa's post-election democracy, of course. A look at the concept of freedom from all different angles. I'm joined by the Nelson Mandela Foundation Narrative Development Manager. It's Kneo Mokgopa, who's made time for us this morning. Kneo, hello to you. And when I knew I was doing the interview this morning with you, I actually went and downloaded the podcast. I use an Apple iPhone, so I've got, I think it's Apple Podcast. They're all there. You've got some great names there already, so I'm going to be listening on the way home. Congrats. Tell me where the idea of the podcast came from.
Thanks, Gareth. So the idea of the podcast came from after July 2021, actually. What we realized is that there was a difficulty in articulating what had even happened. We'd called it the unrest, we'd called it the food riots, we'd called it the insurrection, and many other names. And so what really landed was that it was a rupture. It was a rupture in the fabric of our society, in the nature of the country that the Constitution is trying to build. We keep pulling away from that promise that we made to each other. And so with Old Mutual, we decided then to produce a podcast that would explore what is freedom for contemporary society in South Africa today.
And it's not just talking to analysts. I mean, that's what I do for a living. I talk to political analysts about issues like that. I mean, if I just take a look at one of the episodes, I think it's this latest one that you've got Mpumi Umtumbeni on as well. It's a performance from a theatre production as well. So it's not just talking heads. I mean, it's very cleverly done.
Thank you. So we really tried to approach it in a very interesting way, really recognizing that the personal is political, and that not only is it, public intellectuals that have things to say about freedom, that have significant contributions to give to us, to share with us in terms of our thinking around freedom, but there's artists, there's sangoms, there's traditional healers, there's activists. Mark Haywood is there, Kelly Eve Koopman is there, poets and others. So yeah, really, really diverse group of people.
I see you've even got Tsepo Madlongozi as well, Professor Madlongozi. So you're going to go into the academic, historical side as well. I'm curious, why a podcast? Why go that way? I imagine you're trying to reach as many people as possible. Do you find that podcasts have the penetration that you're looking for? Of all the platforms, you could have gone TikTok, you could have gone Vodcast, YouTube. I mean, you do this for a living, so I mean, you'd know what to go for. But why a podcast?
We think that a podcast, on the first hand, it's relatively new in South Africa, and that there's been a couple of podcasts that really broached the scene and really produced some exciting things. But at the same time, it's this comfortable medium where, on the one hand, a public dialogue, a panel discussion, for instance, happens once and you don't really get to kind of listen to it again. When it's recorded, that's a lot of data that you're asking people to use. If you especially in South Africa, when you're asking for a broad base of people to be able to access it, a podcast seems to sit in that sweet spot where it doesn't cost necessarily anything in and of itself. It's quite low in terms of data usage, but it's also publicly accessible. And so you can go in and listen again and take notes and kind of come back to it. And that's really what we wanted. We wanted a resource that almost acts as an archive that perhaps future generations looking at freedom could be inspired by.
And obviously, we're going to encourage people to go and download it as well. If you are busy on your phone at the moment and you're looking for a podcast for the weekend, there's a couple of episodes there again. Just go and on your podcast player, whatever podcast player you're using, by the way, just go look for Freedom After, the Nelson Mandela Foundation as well. I see Mark Haywood in here as well, and it's interesting to see, and it's good to see as well, that someone who is as critical as Mark Haywood, veteran activist, of course, you address the issue of whiteness as well. I think all those years ago, 1994, yesterday, back in 1994, there was a dream, but there was still the big issue of race. And often it's not dealt with, but I imagine Mark, I haven't listened yet, I've downloaded it, but I imagine Mark addresses whiteness and how it was viewed back then and how quickly it was supposed to change, but it didn't really change as quickly as people hoped.
And I think what was so fascinating about Mark's episode, especially when he kind of delves into whiteness, is that it's not a simple story. I think there's a way that we want to kind of simplify whiteness, especially in the ways that we talk about it these days. But he really complicates it, and he's not speaking to black people, which is another interesting part, is that he's almost speaking to white people himself and saying, we need to understand what this whiteness is. We need to begin appreciating what white power is. We need to begin appreciating the eyes that we have, the skills that we can contribute as well. And that for the longest time, white people have not necessarily been contributing or acknowledging acknowledging the kinds of space that they occupy in society. And there's a huge opportunity there for freedom to be created in collaboration amongst many different races.
So you're the narrative, you're part of the narrative development, and I suppose it almost becomes a bit editorial for you as well. You've got to try and weave this, I'm going to use a terrible cliche in PR and advertising, this golden thread of narrative. Just how political do you go on something like this? I'm asking, do you go quite currently political? Because it's freedom after. And just because it's part of the Nelson Mandela Foundation doesn't mean it's just about Madiba. How current do you get? Do you start delving into things like politics, or what's the angle here? Are there things you just don't want to go to because you don't feel it adds anything?
I think more than anything, we were more interested in the personal. So we wanted people to begin identifying how the grand political narratives about freedom, about the constitution, about, Madiba, Biko, and otherwise, that they're personal, that freedom only really matters to you if it has a personal resonance, if it has a personal kind of appreciation and cadence for you, you know what I mean? And that you make meaning out of what freedom means for you. And that's really what we wanted to explore. There is another podcast that we'll be releasing later on in the year, actually on the anniversary of the unrest. It's called Bupa Mhlaba, and there we really are specifically, very clearly political, and looking at the history of KZN, looking at what happened in July of 2021, looking at the different actors, Jacob Zuma's contribution, all various angles.
Yeah, and that's coming out later this year. Hopefully you and I talk when that comes out as well, because I'm a big fan of podcasts. I think it's all I listen to in the car as well. As I say goodbye to you, I hope you get the 5-star ratings. I hope you get the subscribers as well. By the way, if you're not a big podcaster, please don't just go listen to an episode and leave. Actually subscribe and leave them a review. It helps get the ratings up so more people see it. By the way, just thought I'd punt that for you, Kneo. Just as I say goodbye, though, so I've got it on an Apple device. Is it available on all the different platforms, or is it just sitting on one platform for the moment? Where can people find it?
So people can find it on Apple Podcast, it's on Spotify, it's on Listen Notes, and so many other places that people listen to their podcasts. But yeah, the website, the nelsonmandela.org website, will also be a nice place to access various other episodes and other things like that. But yeah, most podcasting platforms, Apple, Spotify is doing really well. It's available and it's out.
Yeah, what do they always say in podcast? Wherever you get your podcast at the moment, you can grab the newest one. And Kneo, I want to wish you all the very best, you and the foundation as well. I got it on the phone, I really have. I'm seeing there's 5 episodes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 episodes so far. So guess what I'm listening to in the car on the way home. Kneo Mokgopa, thank you very much indeed from the Nelson Mandela Foundation. Just a reminder, it is Freedom After. It's coming up as one word on my Apple podcast player, but just go look for it. It really is going to be a great podcast series, especially with elections coming up.